Greetings Indie Warriors and welcome to I Dream of Indie. My name is OldGamer Joe, bringing you a review today of action side-scrolling brawler Chenso Club on Steam PC. The Chenso Club consists of 5 members who are trying to defeat aliens that have overtaken a castle. It's really that simple. The game does feature a few storyboard segments and attempts a bit of humor, but some grammatical errors and poor overall writing honestly had me mashing through most of these scenes in a hurry. I feel like they might have you doing the same. The jokes fall flat, and while this group of unlikely heroes had potential to be fleshed out and realized, the game misses the mark in that department, so the story here, not going to be the strong point. This can be forgiven, however, as let's be real, you aren't playing an action side-scrolling game for the storyline, so long as the gameplay is fun and enjoyable, right? And while there is some fun to be had in Chenso Club, the gameplay loop ultimately gets pretty stale and boring rather quickly. Chenso Club is, to its credit, very easy to pick up and play, and does actually allow for 2 players. The game is broken up into 5 different worlds, which are then broken up into some randomized levels, and while the idea of each run feeling different is nice, Chenso Club ultimately ends up feeling all too familiar in a hurry. Gameplay mostly consists of jumping, falling through platforms, and attacking enemies. You do have a dash which allows you to go through certain obstacles like blades, and then of course your standard light attack along with a more powerful attack that needs to briefly be charged depending on your character. There are also plenty of power-ups and collectibles along the way like shields which will allow you to take more damage, or a boomerang to throw. Your goal in the game is to go from room to room clearing out the enemies and then moving on to the next room. That's basically it. Clear the enemies, next room, this is Chenso Club. Rarely will your platforming skills be tested, though there are some bonus rounds which I'll touch on a little bit later. So the challenge is going to come from the 4 different difficulty options that are presented. These range from a complete cakewalk where you have 200 blood to a very solid challenge, so credit the developers for having options. Sometimes adding to the challenge are optional fortune tellers that can make levels more difficult, netting you a greater reward. This can range from making a room dark and difficult to traverse, to boosting enemies, making them harder to take out. You collect blood from fallen enemies, which can then be spent in random shops that are also scattered across the levels, and this blood acts as your health, so you won't necessarily want to buy everything that's available, as death in Chenso Club will mean going back to the start of a world. As you go from room to room, you might also come across a groovy cool bus, and hopping in leads to bonus rounds, and this is actually where your platforming is tested just a bit more. These segments were honestly more fun than the main game. Chenso Club also features an interesting concept where you are on a social media app called Chirp. At the end of each level, which usually ends in a not-so-thrilling boss encounter, you'll have to pose for pictures in order to gain followers. This minigame is sort of lame, and it has you fighting off paparazzi, trying to frame yourself perfectly. It's just not that fun. As more follow you on Chirp, however, you will be able to unlock more and more abilities in between levels, so at the least, it's an interesting concept even though I didn't love it. I did like how each character in the game feels fairly unique from one another, however, and yes, you will need to unlock these characters. It's not difficult to do, especially if you're playing on the easiest difficulty, but whether you're a stealthy ninja or you're wielding a fire hose, characters are limited in their movesets, yes, and combos maybe aren't special or deep, but it was fun to switch it up from time to time between the different characters who feel different enough. Another aspect of the game that kept me going for this review were the visuals, which are fairly nice throughout, with solid colorful pixel art on display. Some creativity did go into the enemy designs, which are definitely a little on the weird side, but that's cool, and most of the experience is really well animated. It's certainly a bit of an odd duck, yes, but not in a bad way. While there aren't a ton of worlds to explore, the developer has done a solid job of mixing things up, even if they do follow familiar video game tropes such as going to castles and a snow world. Sound design is also upbeat and fun, with a quirky soundtrack that goes heavy on the electronic drums and some frantic melodies. It suits the overall vibe of this title quite well. Sound effects, nothing really stood out to me too much, so that's a little bit of a missed opportunity, as again, this Chenso Club, the group, could have had a bit more personality infused into them. I've listed quite a few negatives, but actually, Chenso Club is not a terrible game. It's a turn your brain off mindless experience that is a little light on content, but it does offer up some fun in short bursts. It's not going to take you long at all to unlock everything in the game, and while co-op is a nice feature, I was ultimately not that upset to see my time with this game come to an end. It's mindless turn your brain off fun, yes, and that's what I love so much about brawler games, but here it just kinda got dull for me. The levels never seemed to go anywhere that interesting. The combat is serviceable, but really not all that exciting, despite the game's best efforts to have you chain together combos and such and throw in some power-ups. But inevitably, you just feel like the game lacks variety, even when it tries to mix things up. Chenso Club is a decent weekend romp, whether you play it single or multiplayer, but ultimately forgettable. Thank you so much for supporting clickbait-free content right here at I Dream of Indie, and we would now like to pay tribute to the brave indie warriors and legends that make this content possible. At the Indie Warriors tier, we have Bill, Adriana Amato, CJR, Julian Colbus, Ray Lynn, Marky Mint, Dave Harp, Peekaboo, Lex Noyle, Christian Cruz, PSC, Solaru C, Chic Geek, Ancha277, Acrophobe, Raphael Andrioli, Marty DMF, and Randy Pinball. At the Indie Legends tier, Nathan Moore, Skepticism, Jen Rose, Chris Jackson, Mr. W, Blue Francis 14, The Beefarinis, Business Cody, Chiron, Jace Glover, King of the Hatch, Ophidian Mind, Lord Metroid, Seacoil, and Larkison. Thank you so much for everything that you do for independent developers, publishers, and for I Dream of Indie. Help us bring a voice to the voiceless ones in gaming.